Welcome to the Broker Podcast with Jack Stapleton, founder, co-owner, and broker of Realty Texas, one of America's most respected independent real estate firms. Early in his career, Jack was named Realtor of the Year, top producer, and helped over 1,000 families buy and sell properties. Later turned industry leader and broker, Jack founded Realty Texas and built it into an empire with over 400 agents, tens of thousands of transactions closed, with billions in production. As former board president, NLS chairman, real estate instructor, software engineer, and technology innovator, Jack knows what it takes to succeed at every level. Everyone thinks they know real estate. Few actually do. This is real leadership and proven results. Welcome to the Broker Podcast.
Welcome to the Mega Real Estate Podcast. My name is Jack Stapleton, CEO and broker. With me today is Michael Potter.
Hello, Jack. Thank you for allowing me to come in here and ask you a couple of questions.
It is my pleasure. Before we begin, do you know what significant milestone was reached in October?
And he's stumping me on this. Actually, I do not.
You don't?
Mm-mm.
Well, it's congratulations is in order. You obtained your real estate license October 10th, 2005. So 9 days ago was your 20th anniversary in real estate.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Thought you might find that interesting.
That is interesting because I was not aware of that.
Well, congratulations.
My license actually didn't come up until November.
Yep, October 10th is when you got your license. You actually were licensed 4 months before me in the state of Texas.
Wow. Now that is incredible.
All right, so Michael's got some questions from some of our users. If you've got questions, try to stump your broker, want to throw some questions at us, feel free to put some questions in the chat. So what's our first question?
So the first question that we have today, Jack, has to do with the NAR settlement that happened recently. And the question is, with the conclusion of the NAR lawsuit and the new compensation structure now in effect, the way agents are paid and how those conversations happen has fundamentally changed. What should real estate professionals understand about how compensation is negotiated in 2025, including the shift away from automatic seller paid compensation, the requirement for written buyer broker agreements, and the removal of compensation offers from the MLS?
Well, I don't think we're going to be able to finish that in a 30-minute podcast, to be honest. That's a mouthful. All right, so that's a lot. I'm going to, out the gate, my first response is going to be that fundamentally, nothing has changed. Fundamentally, everything's remained the same. But I think the understanding about how compensation works has fundamentally changed. And I think that's good. From the beginning of time, it has been that a buyer agent is hired by the buyer, and they are hired through a representation agreement. And the buyer agrees to compensate the buyer broker through that buyer representation agreement. So the buyer is the one who has always paid the commission. Now, the question was whether or not the seller was going to reimburse the buyer for the buyer's compensation to the broker. And I think that there's been a lot of bad behavior out there by real estate agents who maybe didn't understand the value proposition, maybe were afraid, intimidated by having conversations with consumers regarding compensation, and would tell consumers things like, don't worry about my compensation because it's free, which is false, unless they were truly a nonprofit and not working for compensation. But under the brokerage model, it's a for-profit model. So I think that was confusing to the consumer and sending the wrong message. Agents need to get hired through representation agreements. Tell the buyer that that's going to be their fee, and that before they walk into a property, that they're going to inquire from the listing broker whether or not there is compensation offered, so that when a buyer previews a property, they can take into consideration as part of their negotiations of whether or not the commissions are going to be reimbursed, so they can factor that in. I think a lot of times buyers didn't have the ability to factor that in their negotiations because the buyer didn't even really understand what the compensation model was, and sometimes the buyer didn't even know how much the buyer agent was going to be paid until closing, when they saw it on the closing disclosure. So a lot has changed. What fundamentally changed was before a buyer can before the buyer can tour a property with an agent, they need to have a representation agreement signed before they tour, or some type of touring agreement. NAR actually says some type of an agreement. It could be a showing agreement, it could be a representation agreement. But in any event, there should be a conversation between the buyer agent and the consumer about, number one, getting hired for the job, number two, how much the broker is charging the consumer, so the consumer can make an informed decision. That's really the gist of what has changed. And I think it's good for consumers to have a profession that now is going to force the hiring to happen in a more formal way, instead of what was happening prior to August 17th, 2024, which was an agent would just start pretending to be someone's agent and start providing services, and then maybe help a consumer fall in love with a property by showing them 5 or 6 previous to any conversation taking place regarding being hired for the job. And then the consumer say, well, let's put in an offer, and the agent maybe or maybe not slip their buyer representation agreement behind that contract to get hired to do the job in a very sneaky in a very sneaky way that it's not transparent, leaving the consumer to have never really had a choice and to have never had the respect or honor to hire their agent to do the job in the first place. The conversation should have happened sooner than hidden behind a contract, in my opinion. And for this firm and myself, I've closed now over 1,000 transactions. In Realty Texas, the firm that I am the CEO and broker of, we've closed 10,000 transactions. And since day one, we have required representation agreements because we understand that model. But we would find ourselves in situations where we are the listing agent and we knew that the buyer agent didn't have a representation agreement. And that's a whole nother lawsuit coming down. That's a whole nother set of changes that's coming, even from the Texas legislature. So that was a long answer, and it didn't even touch on all of the points on your paper.
That was a very good answer, though, because I think it does come up a lot as far as that lawsuit and compensation. And there is another form that needs to be used that I think some agents are also having some questions about.
Yeah, there are. 2402, I guess, is what you're speaking about. But even before we go there, I think it's even more, especially if you dial in and zoom into the state of Texas. Previous to the settlement agreement, agents were trained that the contract was between parties, and nothing in the purchase agreement pertained to real estate agent compensation. And that changed, and that was a significant change. And now in our paragraph 12, settlement and other expenses, there is a paragraph where the seller can participate in providing compensation to the buyer broker fee right in our contract. And I think that was helpful. But I also think now buyers get it a little bit more, because now they have a mechanism in the contract that they can specifically negotiate compensation for their buyer agent. And we didn't have that before. So there's really 2 models out there. There's the cooperative compensation, where the seller is going to pay both sides through the listing broker. So the listing broker then shares part of that compensation to the buyer broker. And then the second model is through the contract. And I think a lot of brokerages, especially after feeling the sting of these multi-million-dollar settlements, that they don't want cooperative compensation. They don't want to collect the money from the seller and provide that through the transaction, through the listing agreement, and sharing compensation that way. And that's sad, because if cooperative compensation does happen, then it allows the listing agent to be able to advertise that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a huge piece of information that the buyer may want to know. Because, maybe in the market that we're in right now, it's easier to get closing costs and concessions from the seller. But we go back into a 2020 or 2021 market, then that might not be the case. And, you go back into a market like that, then every single buyer is going to be asking, is there cooperative compensation? No, there's not. Okay. What about those buyers who are marginally qualified, that don't have a lot of cash for down payment? Yeah, there's down payment assistance programs, but that means that the buyer compensation is going to be a check that the buyer's going to have to write, which is going to increase the buyer closing costs. So I think you're going to end up with an affordability issue unless the sellers are more willing to pay or reimburse the buyer broker for the compensation. And so the way that that's handled cleanest, in my opinion, is through cooperative compensation. But we're going to have to wait and see as the market changes how all of this continues down the road.
Well, thank you for that insight. That's really good. Let's move to our second question that we have.
What do you got?
The end of sub-agency in Texas.
It is. I've always looked at sub-agency as this concept of, what if there was no God? We're not going to take this into a religious conversation, but you often hear this undertone that if there were no God, people would not behave.
Mm-hmm.
And that just the fact that there is one creates a little better behavior. And I think that premise applies here, in that those agents who begin to represent a consumer, at least in the state of Texas, is required to have a conversation with the consumer about representation.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a form for that, and information about brokerage services, which talks about the minimum services and buyer agency and seller agency and sub-agency and intermediary, for that matter. But that sub-agency said, almost verbatim, that the agent can assist the buyer but does not represent the buyer and must place the duties of the seller first. Well, that was the line that buyer agents could tell a buyer that would help make the buyer understand that by entering into an agreement with me, there's a fiduciary duty that's created, as well as confidentiality, and it means that I have to, and not just a typical fiduciary duty, but a special fiduciary duty. And that fiduciary duty is the type of fiduciary duty where we put the consumers ahead of our own needs in a transaction, including compensation for that matter. And so the idea of what sub-agency is when a buyer is represented by an agent who doesn't have a buyer representation agreement signed. There's no rep agreement signed. And Texas is a contract state.
Mm-hmm.
It means that there has to be a contract somewhere. And if there's no contract between the buyer broker and the buyer, then the only contract that exists is between the seller and the seller agent, the listing broker. So then the buyer agent, the buyer broker, they piggyback on the listing agreement and they become a sub-agent of the seller. And they would owe their fiduciary duties really to that seller. And if they found out that the buyer is willing to pay more, they would be required legally to disclose that to the seller, or at least to the listing broker. The problem and the issue that's always been about sub-agency is that sub-agency has some rules before it can even take place. And one of those rules is that the listing broker had to approve it. And if the listing agent didn't approve it, then sub-agency couldn't take place. And most of the time, the buyer broker didn't get a buyer representation agreement, nor did they get approval from the seller for sub-agency to take place in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So agency is probably the number one most misunderstood area of real estate today, both with real estate agents and consumers for that matter. And I think that there is going to be some good coming from this. I think that it's going to increase the clarity and understanding of the buyers of when they're represented and when they're not, and by whom. Because now Texas, the state of Texas, is sunsetting the sub-agency and replacing it with what NAR did, which is required as part of an NAR membership, that representation agreements or some type of agreement be in place. So the rules that came down from NAR are very similar to what the state of Texas will be implementing on January 1st, 2026, which is some type of agreement between the buyer and the buyer broker will need to exist before touring a property. And there's a lot of confusion on that out there right now, where I think most agents are assuming that this is residential properties only, but it's not. It's all property types, including commercial. And it is going to be required to be signed before touring a property. So the real caveat is, if you are a listing agent and a buyer wants to see your listing, we already represent the seller. If the buyer chooses not to have representation, then that's okay. You can show them the property. But if you are truly a buyer agent and you have a potential client that wants to see a property, well, then if that is not a listed property by Realty Texas or by your firm, you must get a buyer representation agreement or a showing agreement in place before you can start showing them properties. And, again, I think the really good thing that's going to come from this is that this conversation regarding getting hired for the job and what the compensation is going to be is going to happen earlier, so that maybe even we get back to having buyer counseling sessions, buyer boot camps, where you sit down with a first-time home buyer and walk them through the entire process, which is highly encouraged. But I think the more savvy buyers who've purchased multiple times, they don't want to go through that as often. And I think even if it's offered, they'll decline it. But I'm hoping that it gets back to more formal presentation, so you can set the stage, find out what they're really looking, crystallize the idea of what they're looking for, get the agreement signed, and then start the home purchasing process, especially in a transaction that is so colossal and so huge as a home purchase. And having a representative that's going to help walk you through that transaction to lower your risk and help save you time, that it really should start with at least a face-to-face sit-down meeting to have a conversation about what that looks like.
Yeah, that's a lot of good information on sub-agency. I think a lot of agents don't even realize that they're in a sub-agency type situation.
Yeah, I think right now that if an agent starts aiding a buyer in a transaction and they don't have a representation agreement signed, you're right, they are likely in a sub-agency situation. And they've got two choices. They can, get authorization from the cooperating listing broker and get authorization to continue in that manner, or get a representation agreement signed. And if the buyer refuses to get a representation agreement signed, then they are in a sub-agency as long as the seller authorizes, the listing broker authorizes it. That's today. But moving forward, if the buyer refuses to sign a representation agreement, then that's the end of the road for the buyer agent.
And that's it.
That's it.
They can't work with them anymore.
They can't. The buyer is going to be on their own and likely going to be pounding on the listing agent's door for assistance with generating the paperwork and opening the door for inspections and answering all of their questions, which the listing agent may or may not be open to.
Yeah, and that means it's so important, like you just said earlier, about the information about brokerage services and explaining agency relationships.
It is. And minimum duties.
Minimum duties and getting hired.
Yeah, I think the thing that you're going to see that's going to be the most misunderstood thing for consumers and for agents is this idea of a showing agreement. We've got a buyer representation agreement where there's a relationship, a fiduciary duty, and full services, but then you're going to have showing agreements where the buyer may just want a buyer agent for a per diem to open a door, but they can't provide them advice nor give them opinions. They can only open a door. And that's going to be very difficult for agents to know where they are and remember to not provide advice and opinions, because I think that they are so used to providing advice and so used to providing opinions. It's going to feel very transactional. It's going to feel very cold in a showing agreement for a consumer. And I'm afraid that it's going to give consumers a bad idea of what agency looks like, because if they refuse to sign the representation agreement and they want to quote-unquote test the waters and sign a showing agreement instead, the consumer is going to get a very bad taste in their mouth about what it is to work with a buyer agent, because that's not what it is to work with a buyer agent.
Well, they're really not a buyer's agent. They would be a showing agent.
They are a showing agent.
And I think it's going to be very important for agents to understand the difference between those two.
Mm-hmm. Consumers as well.
Yep.
But you're right, specifically agents, so they can explain it to the consumer.
Mm-hmm. Think we got time for one more question?
I think so.
So, multiple listing services across the country are undergoing major changes in 2025 and actually going into 2026 from NAR, new multiple listing options for sellers policy to revise rules around listing statuses, submissions, deadlines, and data sharing between MLSs.
Yeah.
Offers of compensation have been removed from the MLS display. Coming soon policies are being redefined, and new flexibility is being introduced on how and when listings are marketed. How do you think these changes impact cooperation between brokerages, listing exposures, compensation, and client strategies?
Well, to jump right in, I don't think it's going to change how agents interact. I don't think it's going to change the transaction at all. I think that the way I've been explaining the new practice changes from the MLS by one of the practice changes from the settlement agreement, the Sitzer Burnett case, was to remove compensation from the MLS. For decades, the MLS was considered an offer of compensation. So if a seller would hire their listing broker, they would agree on the compensation that would be paid to the listing broker, and in the listing agreement would be hard-coded what the compensation would be for the buyer broker, and then that would be advertised in the MLS. And when you look at what the definition of antitrust is, you get three brokers sitting around a table having a conversation about their fees, and it's the very definition of a Sherman antitrust violation. If the three brokers were to just stop talking and take out a pen and write down their compensation or their commissions on a piece of paper and share it, it's still a Sherman antitrust violation. And if they just take the next step and just take it and put it in a database somewhere forward-facing to the consumers, it's very much an antitrust violation. The thing was that people couldn't wrap their head around was what was being advertised is what the seller was advertising through the listing broker as the compensation, quote-unquote, reimbursement to the buyer for their compensation. So then, is it really an antitrust violation? Well, I think what NAR did was a saving grace for the profession. It wasn't their fault that buyer agents were out there not getting representation agreements signed. And it certainly wasn't their fault that buyer agents were going out and saying that their compensation was free because they were going to get paid for by the seller. That certainly wasn't their fault. They teach classes like ABR, Accredited Buyer Rep, SRS, Seller Resource Specialist. I teach those courses myself in-house. In fact, I'm accredited by the National Association of Realtors as an instructor, and I teach all of those classes. And we have taught for years the importance of buyer representation agreements. Pulling the commission out of the MLS, the big change was that the buyer agent had to pick up the phone and call the listing agent and say, are you offering cooperative compensation? And, I think that that's actually a good thing. I think that there should be more communication between potential buyers and their agent and the listing so that they could find a new conversation in real estate about what documents they have provided, what is the seller looking for, do you have any other offers on the table? And so I think that conversation is welcomed, and one of those questions, just one of the many questions, is the seller offering cooperative compensation, yes or no? And not beat up the seller or the listing broker because they're not, because it's now just a piece of information back to the buyer. They are or they're not. So now the buyer can choose to negotiate that through the new paragraph 12. So again, I don't think that there's going to be a lot of impact. If anything, I think it's clarified and made things a little bit better. Now, the other question is, what does MLS look like on the horizon? I've spent the last 20 years in the MLS space. I've been a two-time MLS chairman. I served over 10 years on a MLS committee, and I helped create a regional MLS. And I helped build the policy, helped hire the association executive, and we built it out as a shareholder system. In fact, I drove to over 70 realtor associations in the state of Texas and sat with their board of directors talking about bringing the MLSs together and cooperating more. Because the big issue that we have is that at the time, there was over 900 MLSs in the country, each with their own database, each with their own policies, each with their own rules, each with their own fees, and they didn't share data. And a lot of these MLSs were small regional MLSs that had overlapping lines in marketplaces, where one agent might have to join multiple MLSs in order to practice real estate, which means they've got to pay multiple fees, they got to mark the property sold multiple times, they got to enter the property multiple times, and you have to follow the rules. Each individual MLS might have different statuses, might have a different idea of what off-market means, might have a different idea of what on-market means. For instance, active contingent, having a property that might be in a contingency, whether it's inspection contingency or an option period type contingency, is that on-market or off-market? And these arguments and conversations were happening in rooms across the nation in these 900 different MLSs. And the fees associated and the innovation that is possible is diminished by having all of these different MLSs. I mean, imagine we had one MLS and the MLS vendor had the power to innovate that one MLS. We would have an incredible backbone system that would be light years ahead of what we have today. But instead, they are working on special reports and adding features to 900 different systems, which means, they're spread thin trying to roll out features for individual clients of theirs. Maybe the California Association of Realtors, MLS, they want to have a bunch of new features, and Texas has got some features, and then CoreLogic, one of the providers, maybe they have to spend 2 months working on California, and when they're done with that, move over to Texas. That is the problem with MLS. The problem that you have comps that maybe appraisers don't see, because in one MLS is some of the listings and another MLS is some of the listings. And so now you've got valuation issues, you've got issues with real estate agents not being able to properly do a CMA because they don't have access to all the data. And it could be a price barrier, it could be an affordability barrier for a real estate agent that is going to have to pay multiple subscription fees and maintain those subscriptions, and again, understanding the rules. So I think that the value of the MLS is there. I think the value of the MLS is there as a syndication engine that's going to help market the listing, especially as it's going to syndicate that listing to all the portals, whether that be Realtor.com, Homes.com, Zillow, and the rest. I think there's a lot of value there, because I don't think that your average agent or even firm, for that matter, is going to have the back-end technology that's going to be able to take a listing and syndicate it as cleanly and as smoothly as the MLS can. But I think that the biggest issue with the MLS today is not the MLS and it's not the vendor. It is the real estate agents themselves. It is the board of directors of the MLSs, and it is the associations that specifically are concerned that if they were to cooperate and work and turn in their MLS into a regional and start, working with other associations in tandem, that they're going to have a lack of income, and that income is going to diminish the association itself. The National Association of Realtors was provided the guardianship of our MLS many years ago. And we believed that they would be good stewards of our data, they'd be good stewards of our platform, and more importantly, that they could take custody of this thing and turn it into something great. And when you look at what a real estate association is today and what an MLS is today, I'm not so sure that the National Association of Realtors is the right entity to house MLS anymore. I think that there is likely better candidates for it now. For instance, the Council of MLS, CMLS. I think that is a much better candidate to take the MLS and move it forward. And I think whoever really steps up to the plate to create a national MLS, I think that those organizations who have refused to play nice in the sandbox, which in my definition is consolidating and being a shareholder in a larger regional MLS, they refused to do that for whatever reason. I think that they are going to lose the MLS revenue 100%, because I think that once we do have a larger statewide national MLS, I think that the users are going to abandon those MLSs because they're going to see that they don't really have any value anymore. And I think that that is going to be the future of the MLS. It's going to be consolidation. It's going to be a larger system that services more people. It's going to have economies of scale because you're going to have a better price point from the vendor maintaining one system. It's going to be less for each agent to have to pay to get into it through the economies of scale. And it's just going to be better. It's going to be a better platform because of it. So if I have to fault one thing or one entity, it would be us, the real estate agents, not being able to see as volunteers at our local associations, serving as MLS directors, that at the end of the day, the MLS services real estate agents. And real estate agents is the customer of the National Association of Realtors. And there is this fiduciary issue that I think it's being talked about a lot at NAR. It's being talked a lot through MLSs and the local associations about when you serve as a fiduciary for an association, that you're supposed to put the association first. And they have a real hard time remembering that, okay, yes, I'm going to put on my association hat, or I'm going to put on my MLS executive hat. But at the end of the day, if you don't take into consideration your customer in those conversations and you alienate your customer, then you've got no customers and you have no association to have members or an MLS to have subscribers. And I think that a lot of MLSs are finding their way right now, found a path that's going to lead to that, unfortunately, or fortunately, because whether or not that association continues having revenue is a decision that has to be made today. And that decision is going to be whether or not they jump on the board for consolidation and become an owner of whatever this big shareholder system that's going to be the last one standing. And it's my hope, because I believe in the local association. I think that there's a lot of good in having a local realtor organization. If those local realtor organizations choose to work together and create a larger regional where they have an ownership, even if it's just a shareholder, smaller percentage ownership, then they're going to continue having revenue from the MLS. And your local associations typically cannot survive on dues revenue alone. So either dues are going to go up considerably, or the MLS and the association both are going to go away. So I know that's a long answer for a big question.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's a lot. And it is happening right before our eyes, real time right now.
Yeah, we are seeing a lot of mergers happening right now.
Far too few.
Mm-hmm.
Far too few. It needs to pick up the pace. I mean, we're sitting in 2025, and we should have seen a lot more consolidation at this point. So hopefully the future holds better news for the MLS as us real estate agents get out of our own way and work together and consolidate MLS to be what it could be if we were to get out of our own way.
Yeah, I think it'll be a benefit for all.
Absolutely. Well, if you have any other questions for us, please leave the comments and your thoughts in the chat, and we will bring those thoughts and comments to our next podcast, and we'll see you on the next one.
All right, we'll see you then.
Bye, guys.
Take care. Bye.